So welcome back, everyone. We've arrived at the final panel of our conference, and this is our most participatory discussion. And we are fortunate to have with us Maria Hinojosa, who is going to be the guide in this conversation, the town hall portion of this. And as we considered, as we thought about this, we wanted the final discussion of the day to be a culmination of the previous conversations and the previous panels and discussions. We wanted to kind of build on everything that's been said and been discussed so far. And so we are very thankful to have Maria with us. And she is the founder of the Futuro Media Group, as well as a good friend of the Columbia Journalism School and person who's participated in so many of our events. We could go on and talk about her importance for a good part of the afternoon, but I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Maria. Thank you.
My assistant, Penile Ramirez, graduate of class of 2022 business at the J School. Hello. And can I just say, can I say a little bit about cómo fue? Okay. No, I actually think it's really important, the conversation. So first of all, this is the most participatory panel, as Dean, I guess gotta call him Dean Jelani, Dean Cobb. Has said. So I'm really expecting, and I'm a professor. I'm the first inaugural distinguished journalist in residence across there at Barnard College, my alma mater. Not that there's a competition between the two, but there is. So just really, really expect this to be conversational. I'll just be walking around. We have mics, so if you have a question, you raise your hand. But anyway, let me get to Penile, because Penile Ramirez is now the co-director, along with me, of the only national investigative unit in the United States in English dedicated to reporting about Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, Latine, and immigrants and refugees, and essentially everybody who is outside of the mainstream necessarily, but we're really focusing on those communities. Penile is Cuban-born, raised in Mexico, and came to New York actually for safety, because she is such a badass journalist that the Mexican president names her by her name, talked about her work, which ended up actually being one of the reasons why I wanted to hire her, because of her phenomenal work. And so we are changing how investigative journalism looks and how it's done. You know that line from the movie, "I'm the captain now"? I'm 60 Minutes now. This is 60 Minutes now. Penile and I are the ones that are running the show. And we just won for our first piece that dropped, called Death by Policy, taking on a little law enforcement agency known as the Border Patrol. I'm joking, right? It's the largest law enforcement agency in the United States, and it is majority Latino and Latina, and they tell you that they are all about saving lives. In fact, their policies essentially lead to death, and we just won our first IRE award with our first piece that we've dropped. Yes, apologies. So I just want to really commend Penile and also the J School, because Penile, as a student here, Latina through and through, did not necessarily see herself in the mainstream US media. And so for journalists who are not part of, the majority culture, let's just say, if you are not white, a lot of times you're going to give up, because the structures, as we were talking about, can seem pretty intense, and it feels really hard. And at that point, actually, when Penny was really in a moment of, am I doing this or not? So find the people who you respect, because Penile came and met with me across the street there at Barnard. And as many journalists of conscience, because to me it's not so much that you're a journalist of color, it matters that you're a journalist of conscience, right? So many journalists of conscience have to support each other, right? In a moment of like, no, absolutely, you're a badass. You got this. Come on, you're going to do this. And then, surprisingly, I end up hiring her, which was like fabulous. And then because of Penny Lay's investigative journalism, we produced a podcast that essentially took off. It was a sleeper, and then it became a sleeper hit. And there was so much love for it that we had to actually do it in Spanish. It's called USA versus Garcia Luna. If you haven't listened to it, it is very funny. Even though we are taking on the second largest narco trial in the United States, second to El Chapo. He was found guilty. This just happened. But so you should definitely listen to that, because what we did is the story is so unbelievable that we called it When True Crime Meets Telenovela. Thank you for the laughter. And we actually took out a bottle of tequila and said, okay, we've got to talk about this with a bottle of tequila. Of course, our lawyer was like, you cannot do investigative journalism with a bottle of tequila. And we were like, yes, we can. And we did. And it was great. But the point of the story is that it is essential for you as students to definitely fight for your place. It is not going to be a given, especially, frankly, if you are not white, absolutely. You're going to have to fight that much harder. But the message is, you better believe in yourself, and you better know why you do what you do. So why do I do what I do? Because I felt invisible. As you know, I was growing up at a time when there were no women journalists, certainly no Latinas. Can we open the shades, please? Can we do that? Because I really like the green. Thank you. It doesn't bother anybody, right? It's vitamin D and green. And it doesn't mean that we can't look at this, so we'll open up those. Anyway, so for me, oh, that's so good. Don't we all wish that we had automatic curtains in our homes? Make it so much nicer. Wow. So, I did not feel represented by American mainstream media, and yet I was addicted to it. We watched 60 Minutes every single Sunday. We watched Sunday Morning. We watched the Today Show. We listened to radio news. The only person in my home who could vote was my dad. May he rest in peace. Today is actually, it's 8 years since he passed away, so he just made his presence. Hello, Dr. Raul Hinojosa, who helped to create the cochlear implant. So he was a genius, badass. I know, it's kind of amazing. Hola, papi. Anyway, so as somebody who felt essentially unable to participate in voting democracy, to me, democracy was what my mom did, which was to take me out of school with my brothers and sister and to go to a protest and to experience democracy with my feet and with my whole body. And as a journalist, even though I do a lot of things, well, I'm a Mexican immigrant, so I do have 16 jobs. I'm sorry. I can never say no to work. But the most important thing to me is actually I'm a democracy junkie. I'm a profound democracy junkie. And that is because soon after I left this campus as a graduate from Barnard, I had to make a decision to choose to become an American citizen. So I had to raise my right hand, and I had to say that I would be willing to take up arms to defend this country. And I don't like guns. So to have to raise your hand and say, I will take up arms to defend a country, means you take this stuff very seriously. So these things that are talked about, the commitment to democracy and such, for me, is not a given. And that's one of the things that I told Dean Cobb. I was like, as people of color, the conversation about democracy is that is not a given necessarily. During the height of the Trump era, I always knew that there could be a knock at my door. And the knock would be, your citizenship application wasn't exactly correct. You need to come down to 26 Federal Plaza, and we're going to have a conversation. I'm not worried about that happening now, although I have no illusion under this administration versus the previous administration and who runs institutions like ICE and Border Patrol. But the point is that democracy is not a given. And I think that that's the way we kind of, from the base, we approach the conversation around democracy. So I want you to know that there are questions, right? I wasn't here yesterday because we're in the middle of doing, we can't announce it yet, it's not public, but we're in the middle of making a major film and podcast about Uvalde. So there's a conversation about something like utter gun violence and how that impacts democracy, because it does, especially in a place like Texas. But this is a round table, right? That's why I had them move the chairs around so that we could look at each other as we speak. And I guess, who wants to throw out the first question? Anybody? Because if not, I'll throw, oh boy, okay. Just keep it real short. I'm gonna hold the mic.
Okay, so democracy presupposes public control of the government, and we have one branch of the government, the judiciary, that is not under any public control. And in fact, when I sued federal judges for fraud, their argument is that in Pearson against Ray, they gave themselves the right to act from the bench, quote unquote, maliciously and corruptly. So how can there be a democracy? It sounds to me like monarchy, frankly, or 1/3 monarchy, 2/3 democracy, when one branch is so clearly monarchical, so clearly arbitrary, and unaccountable.
So I would say, actually, that for me, the Supreme Court right now, I mean, I think we're all really challenged. So the gentleman raises a really interesting question, because the Supreme Court is something that we all kind of held near and dear as something that was uncorruptible. I don't know if we can say that right now. Breaks my heart to say that, but as a journalist, I have to be 100% honest and transparent. I don't have faith in the Supreme Court right now. But to the question of democracy and covering 2024 and how we do the lead up to 2024, you know, I suppose a question would be, why has the Biden administration not moved on the issue of, let's just say, expanding the court to guarantee that there could be a sense of a democratic institution that we might be more in control of? I don't have all the answers, by the way. Oh, I see somebody else raising a question. Okay, yes, I'm gonna hold them.
So I'm not American. I'm from South Africa. I studied here about 12 years ago, and I guess in my head, the Columbia J School is, you know, it's a big force in not just U.S. media, but in international media by its very nature. And I guess I came here because I'm kind of on the front lines as a journalist, as many people are, not in any kind of particularly dangerous way, but South Africa, you know, covering corruption in the corporate and political realm as a documentary filmmaker and as an investigative journalist. And I think there's such a sense among many of my colleagues working around the world of just total isolation, you know, trying to do the work, trying to figure out how to do that. And I think my big concern right now is the commodification of journalism, how it's been, particularly in the film industry and parts of the industry that are very mainstream, I guess, is that it's kind of been co-opted into the capitalist system, which has some pros. You know, I think it raises the standard for things like documentary film, for example. But what you're seeing is, you know, in my industry right now, there's no way to sell a hard-hitting documentary film that will be seen by, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of people, which was an expectation that was created because that industry was commodified. And I brought this up a little bit yesterday, but I kind of came here to kind of get a sense of how others in the media are feeling, particularly the establishment, I guess we can call this space. And really see, you know, we talk a lot about the problems and the challenges that we all face, and they range from, you know, death threats and violence to, you know, not being able to get in front of audiences. And I want to hear how we can start to vouch for ourselves, how we can find solutions to these myriad problems. How can we band together more? You know, how do we create these networks for independents who are really trying to do the hard work for the right reasons as a public service? How do we find each other and support our industry? Because it's not just an industry. It's a public good. It's part of democracy.
Guess, where in South Africa are you from? Johannesburg. I was on the phone with Johannesburg this morning, which is kind of trippy, but it's true. I'll come to you in a second. The question of, I mean, I think when we get to the issue of democracy, what you're saying is that how, as deep investigative journalists who are doing film, can we create an international community? Independent journalists. I mean, these organizations exist, right, Benile? I mean, there are international, so we don't have to recreate the wheel. You know this, right, that there are organizations, but they're not doing enough for you. Coherent media outside of the establishment. All right, let's see.
Hi, my name is Candace White. I am one of the executive producer of the film clip that you just saw called Flashpoint. And I think one of the solutions to this, I have a background in journalism, but I work for the Knight First Amendment Institute here at Columbia. And I think one of the solutions is to find organizations like ours that will also do storytelling, that doesn't just leave it to an in-depth journalist to do an investigative piece, but to use the mission of your nonprofit institution in this case to also be part of that larger storytelling. And the last question, what stories are lost when journalists are killed or imprisoned? The film, once it's released and hopefully everyone will see it, speaks to that. And it speaks to the chilling effect of the fear that comes with going into protests, dealing with police aggression, and the long-term chilling effect. Like, it immediately stops you and makes you pause and worry about your safety. But then it makes you think, am I going to go out and cover these, hard-hitting stories in the future because I have a family at home, I have a life I want to make sure I maintain and not be harmed. So I think it shouldn't be just left to journalists. I think it should be, I left the journalism field and came into an academic space and tried to bring my talents into this space. And I think thinking outside that box is also a way for us to, find a second life for the work that we do in different spaces. You see the ACLU doing similar work, Anyway, so that's my contribution.
I mean, I think that we're all, I think that there's a whole question of innovation, right? And how we are able to find other platforms. I mean, I know that when I was on a panel, I mean, what year was it? Gosh, before 2010, I think. And somebody brought up Twitter, and it was like, well, that's where young people get their news. And I was like, well, that's terrible. And then I became a Twitter person myself, and now I'm not lost, but Twitter's lost. Now I have an avocado instead of a blue check, but the fastest growing places where the conversation around learning about the news and democracy is actually Instagram and TikTok. It is, right? So we have to do our 1 hour long documentaries that get on a major network, and we do that work when we're lucky to be in that position. But right, and it's a space where the younger audiences are.
19-year-old, isn't going to PBS, where I grew up and learned my news and worked for many years. They're going to the TikToks, and they're not even going to Facebook anymore. That's FYI, right? That's almost, in their worlds, like, an archaic platform. And so you kind of, meet them where they are is a big challenge.
I mean, frankly, I'll put it back on PBS.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I will 100% put it back on PBS, and I am not, yes, I have worked for PBS, they know me, we have a relationship, but I think they have done a very poor job, and that they continue to walk away from more what they consider controversial reporting, which is, for me as a little girl, we watched PBS to watch the movie or the documentary Scenes from a Marriage. It was all about being cutting edge and actually being at the forefront of that. Public funding can have a chilling effect, and it then has an effect on how you choose to put your media out there. So I think it's all of your responsibility to ask more from public media, both public radio and public television. Yes, it's where many of us live, but it's your responsibility to ask for more and more representation, for sure. We have a question over here from a gentleman. Can we get a microphone there?
Yeah, yes, thank you, and it's great to see you, Maria. As I mentioned earlier, I've been a director in the Pacifica Foundation for several years. I started as a journalist in 1972, and I want to talk about ideas of solutions along the public model issue and the media issue. One, I think we need to have a resuscitation of the legislation of the Great Society that created NPR that created public television. We have to renovate it and make it relevant for today. And of course, in the climate now, it's very difficult to do that. But look at Brooklyn. Brooklyn has 35 pirate radio stations operating right now. That says that a lot of people are taking initiative in their own hands to create their own media. And I know that the Pacific station I work with, we have to sit there and negotiate with these guys because they conflict with our radio signal. But I think that that's one thing we have to think about. Secondly, there has to be a cooperation across the board with everybody wanting to change and do fact-based journalism and basically create new models. Because new models is where my head is at. And digitization has tremendous power. But having worked in analog, I know that many of the stations don't have a true synthesis of the power of digitization, and now let alone AI, which is a whole other set of kettle of fish. But I think there's lots we can do that is positive to create solutions to the kind of problems, as I mentioned earlier. I'm an alumni of Columbia. I've listened to these kind of arguments here for decades. And solutions is where my head is at, and that's what I want to think about. Where can we take it into a positive direction so we don't have to come back and be screaming about the right wings doing this to us and that. We just have to think of new ways, and we have to take the initiative ourselves.
So I thank you for that. Appreciate that. In 1970, what year was it? 7, I believe. Puerto Rican activists in New York City took over Channel 13. I bet most of you did not know that. So they actually walked in and they did an action like the actions that were done on this campus, and they took over the offices. And they said, we're not going to leave because you do not represent us and you say you are public media. I mean, how extraordinary is that? That the angst about what public media was or was not doing vis-a-vis Latinos in New York City was such that people felt like we're going to go take over. That's incredible. And so I think that's what you're talking. I'm not advocating taking over buildings, okay? I'm not. But I think that the point that the gentleman is raising is, yeah, you do have to be creative, and you cannot be frustrated. One of the students actually said, "Oh, well, what if I'm going to give up?" It's like, well, what do you give up and do what? Do what? Right? When I graduated, I was serving tacos at Caramba on 96th and Broadway. Maybe some of you had me serve you. But then, right, finally I got my job. Because there's nothing else that I can do but this work. And how we find doing it, even though the compañera from South Africa who's finding these challenges, right, we know that she's going to continue to make these films because she can do nothing else but, even if she has to serve tables on the side. So it's very important that all of you understand, again, for me, essence is my commitment to democracy as a journalist. Because that's what we're ultimately talking about, is democracy and what's going to happen, and knowing that our democracy is in peril. And it is. Okay.
Hi, my name is Reagan Nunley, and I actually built an AI for newsrooms to help your distributors actually read what's coming out of your materials and get those to newsletters, to podcasts, to social media. They're being overwhelmed. We're trying to get that out there. And one of the things that we just received a grant from Knight to build it in Spanish, because I think one of the solutions is not to translate the content coming out, but to interpret the content coming out. And that really is what I think is a solution, is to help to get different thoughts from different places and different people to get the best solutions instead of just the translation that's out there in the existing tools.
Right. We definitely don't believe that it's just translation, right? There's a lot that gets lost in translation. So there's a conversation about, it's always, the horse race. I think in the earlier panel, Nina Berman said, don't go to New Hampshire, don't go to Iowa. And I was like, and then she said, actually go, but do different stories, because the fastest growing demographic group in Iowa is, hello, the largest, fastest growing demographic in Iowa is, thank you, Latinos and Latinas. Hello, y'all need to learn how to speak up. Latinos and Latinas are the fastest growing demographic group in Iowa. For the first time, I think that they had 10,000 delegates for the primaries. Who knows if that number might not be 20,000 this time around. So for us as journalists, it's like, who do you think makes up this democracy? Now, I know if I ask you, you're not going to raise your hands because I'm going to put you on the spot, but I bet a lot of you do not walk around with the framework that I basically wake up and go to sleep with, right? Which is that the second largest voting cohort in the United States is Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, Latine. I know, we like to have 16 names for ourselves too. The second largest voting cohort, not a block. My obsession is that if you are not talking about Latinos and Latinas as voters in your political coverage, you are doing bad political coverage. And what we do know, actually, is from reporting is that if Latinos and Latinas assume the conversation about domestic politics at our dinner table, at our lunch table, at our breakfast table, that this is how we get our community to participate. So our job at Futuro, right, is, as we're getting ready to plan our coverage, right, is how do we do that? Also understanding that it was no surprise to us that many Latinos and Latinas voted for Donald Trump. Not a surprise. But the mainstream, which again, mainstream media is overwhelmingly about 90 to 95%, or maybe I'm getting the numbers wrong, but you get my drift, run by white, cis men of privilege who present heterosexual. You got all that, right? And then the world, our political coverage essentially goes through that perspective. And some of our best friends are white men, of course, but we don't all see the political coverage in this way, right? Again, I stress, to me, it's not so much journalists of color as journalists of conscience. And that means understanding how fragile our democracy really is. I'll throw this out, and then another question, please raise your hands, right? I've said journalists, and I haven't spoken about this with Dean Cobb, but classes here need to be taught in terms of how to do political coverage in the United States by journalists who are living or who have lived through authoritarian regimes. Because the first thing you learn is you don't repeat what the authoritarian says. There's a greater context to that. Editors made a decision to repeat what Donald Trump said, knowing it was a lie. Mexicans, Latinos, and Latinas, when he made that statement, right, we knew this was hate speech. And yet, my colleagues repeated it over and over and over again without any qualifications. There's a problem. There's a cost that comes with that. There's a cost that comes to our democracy with that kind of myopia. Is that the way you say it in English? I say it in Spanish. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm a white cis male alumnus.
And you're my best friend.
Yeah, of course. But I'd like to offer a slightly contrarian view of this. We've heard great ideas here from you, from others, and yesterday about how to reach an audience, how to network, how to produce great journalism. But I would suggest an equally pressing question is how to grow an audience, how to deepen an audience, how to groom an audience if you truly care about democracy. How do you collaborate with other educators if we're part of the same information ecosphere to have more media literacy, more critical thinking, more civics education? That's how you get great journalism. We'll always have great journalists, but if no one shows up to consume that journalism, who cares?
Right, and I think that it's part of our job, right, to make sure that we are reaching that audience. That is part of our job, which is why I tasked PBS to do better, right, and NPR. Yes.
Hi, my name is Christina, and I'm with a nonprofit called the News Literacy Project. And what we do is teach people how to identify and appreciate quality journalism, because we also agree that there needs to be an audience. We talk about supply and demand of things like misinformation. We don't think that we're going to stop the supply. There's too much of it. We obviously cannot rely on social media companies to do anything about this, and we've already gone through a whole host of challenges here in journalism. So we're focusing on the demand side and making sure that people identify, appreciate what you all are doing, which is powerful, impactful journalism.
And that they talk about it and put it out there and recommend it. And
yeah, so we work in schools. We also believe in civics education, providing free resources, curriculum to teachers so they can teach their students media literacy. And we're also working more and more with the public to get them to do things like pause before they share something, on Twitter or Facebook, and do a quick search and make sure it's true. Talk to your crazy uncle about what he shared on Facebook. So yeah, people are, another gentleman was asking about solutions. There are folks working on these sorts of solutions, and we partner with news organizations in all kinds of ways, because we also think it's a matter of survival too for the news organizations to help people be more media literate. So come along. We're happy to have all the support that we can get from folks who are in this room.
And you know what, sometimes look, I'm a longstanding journalist, but in the last election, not the last one, in 2016, I realized that my husband, who is Dominican immigrant, spends a lot of time on social media, he's an artist, and suddenly he was kind of quoting things to me, and I was like, where'd you get that from? And it was a simple conversation of like, okay, honey, here's what we need to do. You need to triple source things. So we understand the concept of triple sourcing. And I love it because it was a simple conversation at home, and it changed everything. Anytime he shows me anything, he's like, I already triple sourced this. And I'm like, okay, honey. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Matt Rybeltowski from Forbes. This piggybacks on your comments about authoritarian regimes. So in Latin America, how much retribution do journalists face for uncovering systemic corruption in terms of narco-trafficking cases, when the local police are involved, when local government officials are involved, national government officials? I think of Alexei Navalny in Russia. There are strong indications that he was poisoned because of the reporting that he did of the Putin regime. So does that present any trepidation to journalists in Latin America to uncover what's actually going on there?
So I'm going to take your question and, how do you say in poker? Raise you? Okay. I don't play poker. Because Penile Ramirez, my colleague, is a direct example of what can happen to you when you're a journalist who is taking on corruption and narco-trafficking. Penny, were you safe in Mexico?
No, of course not.
You took on Genaro Garcia Luna. If you're like, who is that person, just go to our, just then listen to USA versus Genaro Garcia Luna. Just to answer the gentleman's question, what kind of retribution do journalists who take on narco corruption in Mexico face?
Well, the most direct one was the responses that we had from a lot of victims the day that he was convicted, found guilty of all charges here in New York, and that happened like 8 weeks ago. But something else that we have been doing, and that's a true impact of the stories that we have been publishing here about that, is that right now the US Senate has an open investigation regarding this case. So it's not anymore the telenovela story of a Mexican police officer working for El Chapo. It's a major US Senate investigation about why the DA and the FBI vetted this guy and gave him more than $3 billion to work with the US government to quote unquote fight the war on drugs while he was on the side working with El Chapo. So it is about US democracy and US politics. It's not just a random story about Latin America. It's a story about how you American taxpayers, how the money ends up in the hands of really corrupt people, either in Afghanistan or in Mexico or in Colombia or in Russia, and how the US democracy is also supporting authoritarian regimes and corrupt people abroad, and how the US politics is not holding itself accountable. So that's why I'm so happy that even with a bottle of tequila in the podcast, the US Senate is now investigating this case, and they're trying to find out who vetted this guy for almost 10 years, for more than 10 years. So I think there is a direct impact of covering this kind of issues from the American perspective, and that includes holding also the US accountable for the things that happens, not just abroad, but also here with a lot of diplomatic negotiations.
So when Penny Lay and I were covering the trial of Genaro Garcia Luna, let me make this really short, but so because the question that you're raising is about dangerous conditions for Mexican journalists, and yes, absolutely, Mexico is among the most dangerous places to be a journalist. But the case of Genaro Garcia Luna that happened here in Brooklyn, which many of you are like, what are the case? What? So already, why was it not front page news? Well, the United States had some egg on its face because for 20 years they were working with this guy. So to do deep journalism about uncovering a corrupt Mexican government official, the United States would have to, US media would have to turn the camera onto itself. And this, I think, is where we get to the next part of the conversation, which is, so how is US media supposed to turn the camera on itself and say, Jesus Christ, our democracy is not a given, when the international narrative is the world's greatest democracy? And it's like, no. And I don't, again, do we feel safe in the United States when we're covering issues of corruption? Do I feel safe? I don't know. I can tell you one thing. I was denied global entry. Genaro Garcia Luna got his global entry. Convicted narco. But me, who takes on the Border Patrol, which ultimately okays global entry, is like, yeah, maybe not her. Harassment? Is it dangerous? No. So we have to also understand that for us as journalists, the systemic issues that the previous panel was raising, like June and Nina, the systemic issues, right, that we're facing that feels so huge. And yet, the one thing we all know is something called people power. At the essence of democracy, this is Dolores Huerta, who helped found the United Farm Workers, created Si Se Puede. Dolores Huerta always talks about people power within the context of democracy. And Nina Berman actually said, you know, what happens when you have the US military suddenly come into your town and take over space and you can't move them? And I'm like, well, you know where they did move them. Who knows where the people power in our country of American citizens actually took on a military base in the most profound act of democracy? Where did this happen? Thank you, in Vieques, in Puerto Rico. That it wasn't front page news, I think it was front page news, but the US media essentially came very slowly to the story of Vieques. And maybe many of you don't even know what I'm talking about, but the people of Puerto Rico, in their bodies, assumed democracy and got the US military to leave the island of Vieques. It's profound. They also, with their bodies, had a duly elected governor removed from office. that would be as if all of us who got really pissed off with Andrew Cuomo, and I know there was a bunch of us because 3 years ago, I really liked that dude. When I was recuperating from COVID 3 years ago, that was my guy. Que pendeja. Excuse me, what a dummy I was. Right? How did, that would be as if all New Yorkers took to the streets day after day to protest until Andrew Cuomo resigned. The people of Puerto Rico made that happen. They got an American governor to resign because of protest. So my question back to you about democracy, right, is how we cover this as journalists to actually help our fellow citizens understand that they do have power. That it's not just limited necessarily to a vote. Penny, I'm gonna go to the compañera because she raised her hand, okay? Hold on. Yes. Hi! Oh, okay, hi. Oh my God, this is my friend Lauren, okay.
Hi everyone, hello, thank you. I'm Lauren Pafts, I work at the MacArthur Foundation. Not a journalist, but a #1 fan of journalism. And my question was kind of raised earlier today as well, and a through line of the past 2 days has been the importance of history, the echoes in the present day. And I wonder, you know, we've seen the incredible flashpoint around 1619 Project, how it has really, you know, not only been so helpful in reframing the founding of America as a story and a narrative, but has really touched a nerve for people who are quite absurdly denying the facts and the record, the historical record. So my question, and the last thing I want to do is ask journalists to do more, because there's more than enough to already do with the present day. But given this battleground that we're in and this fight that has been started, is it time for journalism to double down on history? There are many more dates that could be explicated. Professor Coronel yesterday was saying about the invasion of the Philippines and how for many Americans that's not common knowledge. I'm just wondering, you know, and it could be a cross-disciplinary exploration too with other parts of the academy, but yeah, I'm curious about that piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you. Mother of twins. I mean, that's badass. That's badass. I think, hello. Ooh, okay, it's getting, now I'm gonna have to run. Okay, we got it. Yes, you get to hold your own mic, Dean Cobb.
So, father of twins. So,
Ooh.
Father of twins over here.
Right.
So, I want to answer that question directly, which is that one of the suggestions, because, you know, the dean does not operate by fiat. I make suggestions just like everyone else and then submit them to the committee for approval. But one of the suggestions that I'm working on is a course called American History for Reporting, which is specifically meant to place the contemporary events that we report on into a kind of historical context, so we understand what exactly led up to the moment that we're operating in right now, in response to your question.
And I think, you know, when we're trying to do this kind of work, and we've got a limitation on how many minutes we can, etc., but why was Uvalde so essential? Okay, I won't ask you to raise your hands because you'll be embarrassed, but I bet the majority of you did not know that in 1970, one of the longest student walkouts in American history took place in Uvalde, Texas, in the same school, Robb Elementary. And the reason why was because kids who spoke Spanish in that school, which by the way is an hour from the US-Mexico border, were paddled for speaking Spanish. And in 1970, with the civil rights era that was happening here on this campus, right there, right? Activists, Chicano and Chicana activists in South Texas were saying us too. And that is a central part of our film, which is like, it's not by chance that this happens in Uvalde. It's not by chance. Somebody had a hand up. Okay, you have a hand up and you just ask your question.
Thank you for bringing up Puerto Ricans, Maria. So Lauren and I were discussing this earlier. What is then the challenge in democracy? Because I too have had a love affair with democracy since I was born. I was also born in a country that doesn't see me as fully American. I'm Puerto Rican. English is not my first language. I do not take freedoms for granted. I don't even travel alone anymore as a journalist. And the rage that I feel after Sandra Bland's murder, because I've been traveling to every corner of the country alone, creating the first visual document of the Puerto Rican diaspora in every US state. I shouldn't be afraid in the country that I love but doesn't love me and doesn't see me as fully American or equal. So referencing our straight white man over here, I think that one of the things that we should do, just as humans, aside from the deeply spiritual work that we do as journalists, is, do we believe in the common good, and are we actually willing to fight for it? So I have, for 20 years, been fighting my people from all walks of life to show rather than to tell that we are part of American history. We are a new expression of freedom and of Americanness, because who is free? Do we actually ask ourselves this? What is Americanness expressed in the 21st century? How will that actually transform? Because if we don't create a much more inviting and realistic picture of what that is, we're fucked, excuse my language. But we're not going to actually function as this experimental democracy if the definition of what American is not expanded.
And that is perhaps our greatest challenge, right? That in 2016, everybody was like, oh, it's an economic argument, it's an economic argument, that's why they're gonna vote for Donald Trump. In fact, what we found in the New York Times doing their research and investigation was that white America was afraid of being displaced, moved. So the core issue of challenge in white America over what the reality is. That's why I'm like, if you're not seeing Latinos on every single primetime news panel on cable news, there's a problem. And I'm a contributor to MSNBC, and I'm not on. And I'm having to fight for that, by the way. And I do it not because I need another job, but because I want to save this democracy. And yes, the Puerto Rican question, oh my God. I mean, the Puerto Rican question, and the fact that our mainstream colleagues just are like, Puerto Rico, it's a place where I go for the weekend. No. Okay, compañera.
I'll hold it. Okay. Thank you. So I'm Lisa Vives, and I work on a newswire that I created. And one of the amazing things about this conference was that we shared some of our hopes and fears, and one of them is that we need some support, we need some ideas. We're working alone. We need some collaboration. We have an amazing group of people here, and everybody has something that they can put in the center here and say, I can do this, I can do that. Doesn't mean you have to give up your daytime job, but just we have special skills here. We have special knowledge. We can just let each other know if you need, some information about Puerto Rico or about photo journalism or audio journalism or something like that. You can call me, or you can email me. I think our commitment to working, for the common goal is to put ourselves on the line. We're here. This Dean brought us together. I hope it's for something more than just, swallowing more information. I hope it's going to be for helping each other, and I think we can do that.
And you're based in New Jersey, right? Well, we're going to
Not that far.
No, in fact, we're doing investigative work in New Jersey, so you'll be hearing from us because we're very interested in what's happening with New Jersey. My passport has been renewed, so I can go to New Jersey and Brooklyn. Yes, the fabulous June Cross. Here we go. Yes.
Yeah, I've just been sitting here thinking we're sort of bemoaning the state of media and, talking about nonprofit startups, but we also here at the J School do have a program in computer science and also in data science. And are these new technologies that are being brought to bear on how we do what we do that we, I think, all need to learn. one of my colleagues here who's a computer programmer, I don't know how to do any of that stuff. I went to a class and felt like a kindergartner in graduate school. But he says he can tell when a journalist has written the program code for any program because there's a First Amendment built in into the programming. You can actually see it in the coding. And I don't think we've given control of the product of our labors to these engineers who write algorithms for all of these social media things. And we need to seize back control of production.
Okay. I mean, I feel like in creating Futuro Media, we did seize the modes of production, like a true Marxist would say. Trying to get a rise out of y'all. Are they awake? She just said she's a Marxist. What? But I agree with you, and I think that this is an interesting place where young journalists actually can intersect with older journalists and help us to create those bridges, right? Because many of us do. We are through and through journalists, but ask us to do something technical, and we're just like, oh, Penile Ramirez.
Thank you. I'm Penny Latham. I think you know everything about me by now.
Oh, no, wait, no. I have to say one important thing. Why do you think her name is Penile? Because she's Cuban, and her parents named her after the song Penny Lane, because they're Beatles fans. But she's Cuban, so it's not Penny Lane. It's Penile. Very cute. Okay.
Okay, I have a serious question. When I studied here, I graduated from the same school last year from the business concentration. And in one of my classes, one of the guests was Lisa Cook. In that time, she was a candidate, and then she became the first black woman in the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve of the US. And some big part of her investigative work is about why women in this country doesn't own as many patents as men. And what she said, and that goes back to my question and what June was saying, is who holds the money for this, for doing this kind of investigative journalism, or for doing films, or for doing data journalism, or for doing that kind of work that is expensive. And we are lacking as women, and in our case also as women of color, of that networks. We don't have a rich friend that we met in the private school where we attend elementary school, because basically I was living in a communist country when I was that, so I don't have those friends. So how much influence can have schools like this one, and I think Dean Cobb knows this really well, in getting another type of students, and also getting these students in another types of jobs, or raising money for news organizations like Futuro Media, that you don't need to tell us, oh, do diverse stories, because basically we're all people of color, so we will do that stories anyway. So we don't need to get into the diversification. So how we can influence better in having more money in hands of people like us, to do and not that other kind of journalism that is desperately needed in the US.
And basically, I would come down to, if you want your journalism to survive in the future, you need to be thinking about making these connections, right? Because without an audience, again, que va, right? So if public media does not have an audience, they're not going to have any funders. So what Penny, I think, is getting to is, right, the essence of how we as journalists manage the fact that our country is different than it was, right? And how do you wrap your heads around that? There were a few points that I wanted to make. In our newsroom, by the way, we do not use the word minority, ever. You will not hear the word minority being used in any of our copy. We also don't use the word illegal to refer to a human being in any of our copy. I guess for me, one of the conversations that I was having with Dean Cobb this morning is, and let's get to a little bit of the politics of this. What time is it, by the way, Penny? Okay. Given what I've been reporting on recently, I do feel challenged by structural and systemic issues of corruption or institutions like the DEA or the Border Patrol. I feel very frustrated and very afraid in many ways because of the future of our country. But my question is that how do we enter a conversation with our colleagues where they understand that if they are not a representative newsroom covering politics right now, then they are not practicing excellence in journalism. Because how do we understand that our country, that's why we don't use the word minority, because people are like, wait, what? Aren't you a minority? And it's like, well, are we? Or if we use the term minority, knowing that white America will become a numerical minority within literally a matter of minutes. So do we want to use the term minority? Because then white America will, in fact, correctly be fearful of becoming a minority. Because it's like, Jesus, we know how minorities are treated in this country. We don't want to be that. We don't want to be that. So it's changing the frame, right? I'll tell you, when I saw the documentary, The Fourth Estate, on Showtime, covering the 2016 elections within the New York Times newsroom, June, I'm sure you had the same reaction that I did, which was, in Mexican Spanish, there's something called pena ajena, which means you have shame for someone over there. And I was like, bro, are you not ashamed that you're showing the entire world that in your newsroom you had 2 black people in the year 2016? 2? Dean Baquet, Yamichelle Sindor. Que pena. I would have been ashamed to go on camera and show that. And we love the New York Times. We love them, we'll criticize them, but the fact that they didn't see that, to me, is like, how did you not see that? And the damage that then that wrought in terms of our entire political coverage, right? Because the New York Times is so important. And yet we love the New York Times. What do we want them to do better this time? What do we think we need to be doing better? And, well, look at that. Understanding history, that's good. I actually, about the question of vulnerability, and I'm looking for hands, by the way, the question of vulnerability to me is that I don't think the people themselves see themselves as vulnerable, and I think that I always have a problem with people saying they're vulnerable, they're, marginalized. They may be, but they do not see themselves as powerless, and I think this is important. Okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Isabela Garcia Mendez, and I'm a master's student here at Columbia Journalism School. And my question is, what responsibility do journalists and media organizations have to adapt to emerging platforms such as TikTok? And what are the dangers of the absence of, as you put it, triple vetted information on these platforms when it comes to meeting younger audiences and protecting democracy?
Yeah, well, like I said, my TikTok is going to be launched within a matter of a couple of weeks, so that's what we're doing. But the question of, it's unvetted, right? We have information that spreads like wildfire, which can be good and bad. Anybody want to take a shot at the answer to that question or have another question to add? Did you? Oh, okay. Okay, I'm coming.
Thanks. Hey, I'm Sam. I'm one of the founders of Stacker, which is a data journalism newswire. I'm curious, we talked about public education, social media as kind of institutions or areas outside of traditional news organizations that are essential to journalism getting out there. What other areas need investment, either because they've been weakened or because there's just opportunities to strengthen that relationship?
Question? Anybody? Yes, I see a question or a response to that also.
I don't have a response for you, mate. All right. I have a question. How do we cover the upcoming 2024 elections? as you said that in 2016, Trump peddled a lot of lies, hate speech, and we ran to cover it. Do we still do the same thing, or do we not cover what he's saying?
Dean Cobb, what do you think? Let's put Dean Cobb on the stand. What do you think? What would, if you were the boss, he's the boss, what would you do?
So I think there are a number of things that, even things we've talked about in the course of the past 2 days, I think are applicable. You know, the first is the idea of amplification. And I think that we have, in this country, to your point about people needing to have courses taught by people who've reported under authoritarian regimes, we have a good faith default very often in our media here. And that is that you presume the person that you're interacting with is operating in good faith, or at least decent faith. You know, and this person may be lying around the edges, or you may be having, but the idea of people operating in a context purely of disinformation, I think, is uncommon for very many American reporters, a wide swath of the middle, you know, kind of the middle tier of American journalism. I think the amplification part of it is key, that we don't do that. I think secondarily, we also have to be prepared to operate in a context in which the instinctive reflex to equalize things is not our kind of modus operandi. We've seen how that, in turn, is weaponized. Thirdly, I think that Margaret Sullivan's point is key, that we need to not shy away from the idea that we are an explicitly pro-democracy enterprise. And I think the responsibility of that has gotten away from us. And to operate from that perspective, because we kind of implicitly articulate what that is every time we say the First Amendment. We're saying that we are operating under the aegis of the United States Constitution. That is why we exist. And as anyone who has been in my class knows, I've said again and again and again, people will get tired of hearing it. It was like doctors are really important, lawyers are really important, engineers are important, nurses are important. The Constitution says nothing about any of them. That the constitutionally sanctioned in line of employment is the work that we do. And it's believed that we are supposed to be a kind of immune defense for democracy. And if we have that kind of grounding, I think it's easier to understand the things that come subsequent to that. And there's a whole array of other things that we could go into, but I think those are the kind of big points about how we start and where we begin.
So Dean Cobb has been on my politics show because I think he's brilliant on politics, so let me just squeeze in a question here. So, so what do you say to our mainstream news colleagues who we can see already? And these are our colleagues. They have graduated from the J School, from multiple J schools, and yet we can see that they fall into the frustrating pattern of the horse race or repeating the authoritarian statements without, you know, as you say, equalizing. How do we engage with that dynamic? And I worry that they don't see that they're actually making bad business decisions, because I always try to bring it back to business, because that's what matters in a capitalist society. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, on the business point, you know, we all remember that notorious quote from Les Moonves in 2016, where he said that Trump was bad for America, but very good for news. Now, if we actually understood what we were and what we were supposed to be doing, we would not conceive of it being possible that something could be bad for America and good for news, because the thing that's bad for America is inherently bad for news. And so unless we are thinking solely in the kind of monetary kind of calculation of it, I do think that there's a place, at least what I did personally, was that I tried to engage and to dialogue with people. And so, you know, I had lunch with a very highly placed editor at the New York Times in 2016 about the way that the Times was approaching what was happening. And I said to him very clearly, I said, look, I have to tell you my perspective. I'm the son of a third-grade educated man who grew up in Jim Crow, Georgia. He had a third-grade education because that was as far as black people in his area were allowed to go. What that has given me is a perspective on what the failure of institutions looks like. And I said, for people who operate from the perspective in which institutions have mostly worked to your advantage, you are left with a deceptive understanding of the fragility of democracy. I have no such illusions. And so I do think in our professional organizations, this is something that we need to do, a question that we need to confront. That's the reason that we had this conference, to kind of spark these dialogues. I think that this is going to have to be a bigger conversation within the journalism world about the voices and the perspectives, both in the United States and from outside. When Dmitry Muratov from Novaya Gazeta was here, and he was talking very much about what it is like to operate in a place where your journalists may be killed at any given time, something that the staff of Novaya Gazeta knows very well. And so we hosted Maria Ressa, here at multiple occasions, and talking about that. Like, those are realities that we, as part of this profession, need to have at the front of our minds, and to try, we're trying to start this here, to start this dialogue around this, but we can't do all of it. Like, we all have to go out and be engaged, whether that is in the op-ed page, whether that is the conversation that you have with your colleague, the conversation you have with your editor, what happens at SPJ, what happens at all of the affinity professional organizations, in every tier, in every aspect, and every element of this, because I think that this is, a dire question that we really have to be willing to confront.
So there was a journalism conference attended by some very high level. It's invitation only, and it was 2017. So Donald Trump had just been elected, and I'm going to make a joke so you can laugh. I don't have to make the joke anymore, but I kind of jokingly said to this very powerful editor, so I am 5 things that Donald Trump hates. I'm Mexican, I'm an immigrant, I'm a journalist, I'm a woman, and I'm flat-chested. Thank you. Yes, you can laugh. I don't have a problem with it. So, and then I said to this editor, but Donald Trump really is an affront to everything that I am. So explain to me how I'm supposed to cover him and his presidency objectively. You may not like white male supremacy, but you won't actually suffer if that, as much as it exists, you're not going to suffer. You may not like it. Whereas for us, it is a question of our security, our raison d'etre. And I think that that's the question that Dean Cobb is posing, right? Which is a much larger question, which is, I'm sorry that, at the height of the Trump era, Jelani, I don't think we talked about this, but I was like, we need to have this room filled with this number of people running the national news media, the people in charge, so that we can all talk about what is going on and how do we respond. And then I was like, well, you think they're going to call if Maria Hinojosa says, hey, can you know what I'm saying? And this is, I think, one of the, because I think people like Dean or June or myself or Benny Lay, it's not like we're just like, we'll make our media more colored because that's going to be the best thing. That's not what we're saying, right? But there is a deeper understanding of what is at risk in our country. And that's why I like to talk about journalists of conscience. Not so much journalists of color, right? Although we do face a predicament, but journalists of conscience. And in my most dire moments, and I'm going through a couple of them now, right, I will spend time with Frederick Douglass. Thankfully, his statue is not far from where I live, right? and understand that as a journalist of conscience, a journalist who is not white, that what I do, what you do, what Dean does, what we do is actually tied to Frederick Douglass and this long arc of journalists of conscience and of resistance to authoritarianism and power grabs and taking over democracy. But it's the understanding, right? And what did Frederick Douglass love to do? He loved to criticize the United States, and he got hell for it. And yet he said, it's because I love it so much that I can do this, right? Because I love it so much. Questions, comments? Yes, yes. I'll hold it.
Yes, I have to take off my, I just want to say on Monday when Biden announced that he was running again, the same day that we heard that Fox booted Tucker Carlson and CNN.
Who?
Don Lemon. I was watching CBS Mornings, and they were talking about Biden, and it struck me that their framework was so flawed. We have talked about this. This is mainstream CBS, you know, the 7 to 9 a.m. show, and they basically made it a horse race. It's like, so, you know, Biden is 80 years old, he's going to be 86 by the time the second term ends or something like that. And his approval ratings are so low, they're in the 40s. And furthermore, they just kept making it a horse race. He has not lived up to his campaign promises. I'm like, what? He had 2 hands tied behind his back, and he did a whole lot in the amount of time. I'm not being a Biden apologist or anything. I'm just talking about objective facts. And I honestly could not watch, you know, the CBS journalists talk about this because they were being lazy. That's the truth. They were being lazy. They were listening to the way it's covered, the way it's framed, and instead of really being original in thinking about it, they just kind of went down that road, and it was so frustrating to me. I was like, I had painters in my house, so I just said, well, let me just do things that are more important because I'm not going to learn anything here.
Did you happen to write in, did you take a moment to write into CBS News by any chance?
I should have.
Well, you still can.
I will.
So that's important.
I see mainstream journalists framing things in a lazy way. That's the only thing I don't know.
I would not use that in your opening letter. Because they might just be like, we don't like her. So, but I think that the question of laziness actually, and how do we deal with that, right? It was brought up in the panel. Journalists can somehow just be lazy in their coverage. But I think you want to be thoughtful, and I would encourage you again, don't be afraid of sending that, whatever it is, an email or a tweet or whatever, to say this is what I think. It's important because they are just human beings. Yes. Look, I spoke about this with Dean Cobb earlier. I think that, you know, we're in a very challenging place in terms of covering this election, right? Because as Danielle Moody from the podcast Woke AF said, ultimately, I'll do anything to make sure that the Republican Party does not end up in power. But then we have to live with the Democrats. And I've been around long enough that I was so happy that democracy won, but I didn't have any illusions that it was going to be amazing. Having said that, the entire country came out for these midterms in a way and delivered for this president in a way that historically hasn't happened for decades. You can't walk away from that. But I agree with you, and I don't know how we challenge the question of laziness in our business. And there was another hand over here, I think, yeah.
Just one last comment. I wonder sometimes, you know, that whole thing about we're going to eat the liberals. So sometimes it feels as though the New York Times and some of these other mainstream organizations don't want to appear to be in the camp, in the tank for Biden, and so they go
to the extreme of the end instead of just being objective and in the middle?
Well, the question of objectivity, but I think that they have to be clearer about what is happening here. It is not simply a horse race, right? They have to be smarter than covering it in the horse race.
Hi, my name is Martha Lorini. I'm a retired former business side from the magazine business for most of my career. And I think the voice missing from this conference is the business side, because if we can't find a way to fund this, if we can't find a way to stop the foxes who are just running whatever to make money, we're not going to be able to evolve the way we need to.
So what would you suggest?
The next conference needs to be the business side.
Okay, but give me your headline if you were saying.
Honestly, I don't know. I think we're struggling to figure out how. I mean, I think people have to pay for content, is what and I think people have to be smart enough to know that they need to pay for content. I think it's about education. Your program about news literacy. People need to understand the difference between truth and lies, and care about it. But we also need to fund all these new media forms. I mean, it's evolving so quickly you can't even, your head is spinning. Like, I don't know, is it today it's TikTok, what's it going to be? Well, it's going to be AI tomorrow. So, but I think we need business people in the room who are as ethical as the journalists to work together to find a way to move forward.
I mean, I would say so. I just think that when you look at the demographics, that means that the business people have to understand that the content also has to respond to a different demographic, right? So that you have a future that is sustainable. Was there another question or comment? Just because I know I'm wrapping up, and we're going to have words from Dean Cobb to finish. Okay, I see you, and I see you. Yes, excuse me.
Hi, I'm a health reporter and a beat reporter. I've been a regional reporter in 3 different states. I have a problem with the fact that even though this is a terrific conference, the responsibility has been put on the reporters. We shouldn't shy away from the fact that we're a democratic enterprise, Dean Cobb said. And we are an immune defense for democracy. And as a health reporter, I like that analogy very much. But 2 weeks ago, I'm doing a story about mifepristone and the Supreme Court. I contact the FDA with a couple of questions, and they write back and they say it'll take them at least 3 days to respond to my questions because of the number of inquiries they're getting. Well, I happen to know the FDA has about 1,000 employees around the world. I find it very difficult that they can't bring in a few more people to answer the phones. And every time I see a line in the New York Times and other papers that say HHS or the administration would not comment. Well, that doesn't sound like a democracy to me. And they print that, and the editor prints that line. Well, why is that acceptable? And why am I now looking for a surrogate to the FDA? Because I still have to get my questions answered. You know, how do you take a drug off the market? Who's enforcing it? Who's supposed to, all that sort of thing. Now I'm looking for a surrogate. Well, it turns out that only the FDA is in charge of approving and disapproving drugs. They take it off the market. It's their job. They're the cops. They work for us. There is no other surrogate.
I'm feeling your pain.
And then I'm also on. I should say I'm also on a deadline.
Of course. 2 weeks ago. When I was down in Austin, Texas, covering last week, frankly, very undemocratic experience at the Texas State Capitol. I forgot what I was going to tell you. It'll come back to me in a second.
That people don't talk to you or they exclude you from meetings.
Right. No, it'll come back to me. It's been a long day. I've been traveling a lot. All right. Other questions, comments? Aka? Thank you. Thank you. Teamwork. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I just want to put a comment, and I am a student here at Columbia, class of 2023. After graduation, I would go back to the life that I had before this school, and it is a democracy activist for Vietnam, which is a country I think the majority in this room will not know about its political context right now, but democracy movement. But I really appreciate these 2 days and also the talk about democracy in America. I just want to comment and put all of you in the same thought that appreciate the fact that you live in a democracy like America. Yes, you can criticize it, you can think it's imperfect, but it is a democracy, and journalism is being respected. And you can work and you can hold on to those democratic values because the world, they will look at us. I had lived in Southeast Asia and East Asia for the majority of my decade before Colombia. And I know the people in those places, they looked up to you. They looked up to the work that you do. So I think to protect American democracy is that we hold on to these values and we spread it out and remember that we live in this democracy that people are dying and striving to live in.
Thank you for that, for putting our feet on the ground. I want to respond to that, but I remember what I wanted to say to the compañera over here. When I was in Uvalde and I ended up looking for the other side, right? And ended up speaking to a representative of the Gun Owners of America, who, by the way, were walking around inside the Texas State Capitol, open carrying, in front of the families of Uvalde. And my problem was, where's the compañero? Right, that suddenly, in a conversation, the only response that he could give was that the only answer is to have teachers carrying assault weapons in classrooms. That's it. And then when I said, but sir, you know, the #1 killer of children in the United States is guns right now. And he said, nope, I don't believe that. I'm like, sir, the data is everywhere. Nope, my data says something different. So now we get into a situation where it's like you're going to find the other side. How do we deal with the fact that we're not even in agreement in basic facts, right? How it complicates things. To your point, my life was changed because of the journalism that was done in Vietnam. I believe that my experience as a journalist has everything to do with your country. We all know the picture of the little 12-year-old girl, you know her name? Yeah. Which changed my life forever. Would that picture be run today? It's a terribly disrespectful photograph, to be honest with you. It's horrifically disrespectful to put a child's body on full view like that, prepubescent and all, right? And yet, that image changed everything, right, in our country. Please see the movie Till, if you haven't. That moment, the decision of Emmett Till's mother to say it will be an open casket, which frankly, again, reporting from Uvalde, and there's a Maria Hinojosa before she went to Uvalde, and there's a Maria Hinojosa after Uvalde, same like before 9/11, after 9/11. And there's a part of me that really feels that what I have seen, you should see. And that if the country saw, there would be an uprising. And then someone said, but maybe not. Thank you. But also, I have respect for the families. So I don't want to force them into a situation, but Mrs. Till made a decision of her agency on her own. And part of, I think, what worries me about the tiptoeing around democracy is that we're unable to actually say how challenged, how ugly it really can be, taking into account that, yes, we are in a democracy, very different than in an authoritarian regime, and we're all going to fight for that. But at the same time, our demands of this democracy only can increase. And I hope you will not give up, right? We cannot give up. In fact, South Africa, coño, on this campus, you know, just down the street, right over here, Barack Obama was leading the takeover of the buildings, right? Hamilton Hall, to stop apartheid. And I was protesting across the street to stop millions of dollars in military aid to go to El Salvador, right? How much better has our country gotten, or worse? I don't know. Yes, we did elect Barack Obama, amazing, but yet the commitment that we must have every single day to be that democracy junkie that is at every point. And I love the fact that you're here, because you don't need to be here, right? We don't need to be here. This is the thing that gives me hope, the fact that Dean Cobb is here having these conversations, and that we understand how much is at stake, how important it is that we have the freedom, like Benile now, who's here in this country without fear, but that we have a lot at stake here. And so to the students in the room, please do not give up. I don't want to hear this. I'm going to give up, or what if I... No es fácil. None of it is easy, which is what I tell my students. It's not easy. Ain't no nirvana when you turn 30. It's like, oh, cool, I'm 30 now. I got it all figured out. Or I'm 40 now. I got it all figured out. Oh, I'm 50. I got it. Nah, doesn't happen. So stop thinking it's going to happen and just get to work and keep on working. Where's the dean? Did he? Oh, I just didn't. This guy, I am so happy that he is leading this part of the university. I have so much faith, and we have just mutual respect and love for our country, so thank you.
We thank Maria for this excellent job that she's done in leading this conversation. So there are a few things that I want to say as we conclude here. The first is my profound gratitude to everyone who has come out over the course of the past 2 days and all of the contributions that you've made to this dialogue. Really, really deeply indebted to my team here that really took this idea and ran with it to make it possible for it to happen. And they are here. They can stand up, actually, those of you who are in the room. Dolores Barkley, who's right here. Kyle Pope, who's over here. Who else is? Dan Rivero, who's over in the corner right there, is my chief of staff. Mindy Myers, who's over there, who worked really hard on this as well. Julie Pozo Sabeda, who's not in the room, but she's the events person here, who kept all of these things on track. And we had a board, which this whole this whole conference is a product of this one kind of idea session we had, where we were scrawling things and kind of creating, and it started looking like the villain's lair in a movie, like the grand plan for world domination. And so out of the scrawl and overlapping handwriting that was on this whiteboard, we actually started to impose some sort of order and think about how we wanted to make this happen and what we wanted to do over these 2 days. The most important thing to say is that this is a beginning that we don't think we could get to. We weren't so naive as to believe we could get to everything in one conference. And I think that we don't know what form it'll be or what will happen, but we will be engaging the business side and the publishers around these issues as we head into the next election cycle as well. I will say that when you said the next conference, I heard like the groans of everybody who had organized this one. They're like, but I think there are a couple of final points. One, I also have been remiss which I meant to highlight earlier, my colleague Andy Tucker's book, Not Exactly Lying, which is on the history of fake news and the way in which the history of it is applicable to this moment that we're in right now, which I would highly encourage everyone who's interested in these questions to take a look at as well. And so on this matter of democracy, we sometimes have a sense of ourselves. We use that word in a very casual kind of way. And Eric Foner brought up the point, that our democracy has always been contested, who belonged and who did not, and its capacity to encompass the aspirations and the rights and freedoms of the entire population has been something that has taken, at this point, centuries of struggle to reach the point that we are at now. But what we can say is that our system is only as strong and only as durable as our willingness to protect it. And when our will comes into question, democracy itself falls or falters. There are lots of things you can say about James Madison, slaveholder, brought his slaves to the White House with him, but I'm always inspired by that line from Federalist 51, I believe it is, where he said, if men were angels, there would be no need for government. And if men were governed by angels, there would be no need to put restraints upon government. But in creating a government that is to be administered by men, over men, you first must confront the problem of giving the government enough power, to govern, and giving the people enough power to keep the government in check, or some such. That is our essential paradox, that none of us are angels, and we're dealing with, at best, our flawed human nature. We have a particular investment in this for those of us who understand the difficult and thorny road that we have traveled to get to this place. There's a line from James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice, where he said, we have come making our way through the blood of the slaughtered. And he's talking very much about the African American freedom struggle, but I think that we can extrapolate that language out to any democratic struggle, any struggle of any group of people who have aspired to live freely. That everything that we have achieved has come as we've made our way, treading a path through the blood of the slaughtered. There's something that I do. Some of you may have heard this before. If you have, I'll ask you to bear with me. But it's something I do to try to convey the nature of the problem that we confront right now, particularly in media. And I start by taking a poll and asking how many people in the room played a sport. You can raise your hand if you played a sport. And then I say, keep your hand up if you played basketball, tennis, softball, baseball, or even boxing, because you don't play it, you box. And so the next question I pose is, do you remember the first time you faced a left-hander? Everyone does. I'm left-handed, which is why this occurs to me. When I would raise this question with my students, they would groan. I learned how to hit a curveball, and if you're facing a right-hander, the ball curves in this direction, and it takes a little bit of practice and it takes some concentration, but eventually you will learn how to hit a curveball. But if a left-hander throws a curveball, everything you know is useless. It does the exact opposite. If you've tried to guard someone who's going up for a shot, and they're going up as a conventional right-hander, you're doing one thing. But if you're going against someone who's driving with their left hand, you're doing the exact opposite of what you need to do. We are in a situation, and we have been for some years in a situation, to expand our analogy, in which our media is right-handed, and we're playing in a left-handed circumstance. Is what I refer to as the left-handed problem of democracy. And in those moments, if you behave in conventional ways, if you don't think about the implications of everything that you do, you wind up committing to exactly the wrong strategies. And those are the kinds of things that we wanted to bring to light in this conversation. I think that the urgency of the moment has not subsided, that the dynamics that we see, that each day brings us a new iteration of the challenges and the conflicts that we're trying to navigate. But I also believe that democracy and the preservation of democracy require a fundamental level of optimism. And I don't mean the kind of cheap optimism that we sometimes specialize in, where we say we think that everything will automatically be okay. I mean the bruised, realistic optimism. And whenever I talk about something, people, I always get the question, they're like, are you optimistic? And I say, yes. I give the same answer all the time. Yes, but I have the optimism of a boxer in the late rounds. And what does that mean? It means that if you haven't been knocked out yet, you still have a chance to win. And so we have not been knocked out. We understand how difficult the early rounds have been. We understand how formidable our opponent is. We understand that he throws punches from the left side. But we're committed, and we're on our feet, and we still have a chance to win. Thank you all for coming.